I don't think the biggest problem in Episode 4 is the Klingons. It's Starfleet. And I know that sounds strange because Starfleet is supposed to be the good side of this story. They're the people who explore, negotiate, protect civilizations, and try not to interfere with cultures that aren't ready for them. But watch what happens to Una on Mat'aar XII. The moment she actually sees what those rules mean on the ground, something changes. Because from the Enterprise, non-interference is a principle. Down there it's a choice. And sometimes choosing not to interfere means choosing to let something happen. That's the part one thing Star Trek is quietly challenging here. Una isn't suddenly against Starfleet. She's not throwing away everything she believes in. She's doing something much more uncomfortable. She's starting to understand that Starfleet can be wrong. And once a Starfleet officer genuinely accepts that idea, the rules become a lot harder to follow blindly. That's why I think this episode matters more for Una than it first appears. We've already seen what happens when Starfleet's rules are turned against her. Her Illyrian identity nearly destroyed her career because the institution had decided what was acceptable before it ever considered the person standing in front of it. Now she's on the other side of that problem. This time, she's looking at people who are suffering and asking herself whether following the rules actually makes her the good officer. And I don't think she likes the answer, because there is a very uncomfortable difference between following Starfleet's rules and living up to Starfleet's ideals. Usually, those two things are supposed to be the same. Episode 4 puts them against each other. The situation on Mat'aar XII isn't something Una can understand from a report or a briefing. She's actually inside it. She's surrounded by people living under Klingon occupation, and because she's mistaken for Nivette, she gets pulled directly into the Resistance. That changes the calculation. If she were standing safely on the Enterprise, it would be easy to say that this is an internal conflict, and Starfleet has no place interfering. But once she's there, the consequences of doing nothing are no longer abstract. People are suffering right in front of her. And this is where Starfleet's philosophy gets complicated. The Prime Directive exists because Starfleet has learned, repeatedly, that intervention can cause enormous damage. A technologically advanced civilization shouldn't simply arrive somewhere, decide its own values are superior, and start changing another society. That's one of the principles that makes Star Trek different. But the episode creates a situation where the opposite decision can also have consequences. If Starfleet refuses to interfere every time because it doesn't want to violate another civilization's sovereignty, what happens when that civilization is being controlled by an outside power? At what point does neutrality stop being neutrality? At what point does staying out become a decision in itself? Una doesn't get a philosophical debate about this. She has to make a choice. And I think that's why she's the right character for this story. Una has already been forced to confront the gap between Starfleet's rules and Starfleet's ideals. Her own existence became a problem because she was an Illyrian whose genetic modifications violated Starfleet policy. She didn't suddenly stop believing in Starfleet because of that. If anything, she fought harder to prove that she belonged there. But experiences like that change how you see institutions. You stop assuming that a rule is automatically moral just because an organization you respect created it. And now she's seeing that problem from the outside. She's watching people who don't have the luxury of waiting for Starfleet to decide whether helping them is politically or philosophically acceptable. So when Una chooses to help, I don't see that as her simply becoming rebellious. I see it as the next stage of her character. She's no longer asking whether Starfleet will approve of her decision. She's asking whether she can live with herself if she doesn't make it. And that's a very different kind of leadership. Because leaders aren't always given good choices. Sometimes they're given two bad ones and have to decide which consequence they can accept. That's exactly what Una faces here. If she stays out, she follows Starfleet procedure. If she intervenes, she risks violating the principles she's supposed to uphold. Neither option is clean. And that matters because Star Trek has always been at its best when it refuses to make morality simple. Starfleet isn't evil. The Klingons aren't automatically right or wrong simply because they're Klingons. Una isn't automatically correct because she's our hero. The interesting part is that everyone has a principle they're trying to defend. And sometimes those principles collide. That's the problem Episode 4 exposes. Starfleet has built an incredible system around rules designed to prevent abuse of power, but those same rules can become restrictive when the situation demands compassion instead of procedure. And if Una is beginning to recognize that, then this episode may have planted something much bigger for her future. because there is a difference between being a loyal officer and being an unquestioning officer. Una can be the first without becoming the second. And I think that's exactly where her character is heading. She doesn't want to destroy Starfleet. She wants Starfleet to live up to what it says it believes. That's why her decision on Mat'aar XII is more important than the action itself. She's not rejecting Starfleet. She's challenging the idea that Starfleet's rules should always get the final word. And once Una starts thinking that way, I don't think this is going to be the last time we see her make a decision that puts morality ahead of protocol. That could become one of the most interesting parts of her character going forward. Because the real question isn't whether Una broke a rule. It's whether Starfleet created a rule that needed to be broken in the first place. And that's where I think the episode quietly turns the entire idea of Starfleet on its head. Because if the rules can be wrong, then the person following them has to decide what matters more, obedience or principle. Una chooses principle, and that decision becomes even more interesting when you remember who she is. This isn't a character who has spent her career trying to escape Starfleet. Quite the opposite. Una has fought to belong in Starfleet, even when Starfleet itself made that difficult. So when she reaches the point where she says, essentially, Starfleet isn't always right, that carries weight. She's not saying the Federation is corrupt. She's not saying regulations don't matter. She's saying something much more dangerous to an institution. Sometimes the institution needs to be challenged by the people inside it. And that is where Episode 4 becomes bigger than Mat'aar XII, because Starfleet's greatest strength can also become its biggest weakness. It has procedures for almost everything: first contact, diplomacy, military intervention, scientific ethics, the Prime Directive. There is supposed to be a process, and most of the time, that process protects people. But what happens when the process itself becomes the thing preventing you from helping someone? That's the uncomfortable situation Una finds herself in. She has to make a decision without having perfect information, without having permission, and without knowing exactly what the consequences will be. That's not the Starfleet ideal situation, but real leadership rarely gives you the ideal situation. And I think that's why the episode puts Una in this position rather than Pike. Pike has already spent years carrying the responsibility of command. He's constantly balancing what Starfleet expects with what his conscience tells him. Una is different. She's his first officer. She's the person who has spent much of her life believing in the institution from the inside. So watching her reach this conclusion feels like a warning. Not that she's going to abandon Starfleet. That would be too simple. Instead, she may become someone who starts asking harder questions about the institution she serves. And that could become incredibly important. Because imagine Una a few years from now, faced with another situation where Starfleet says one thing and her conscience says another. She's already crossed that line once. The next time might be easier. And that's how a character arc develops. Not through one giant transformation, but through a series of decisions that slowly change the way someone sees the world. Episode 4 could be the first real step toward that. There's also something very ironic about the way this episode handles Starfleet's relationship with power. Starfleet doesn't want to become an empire. That's one of the reasons the Prime Directive exists. The Federation doesn't want to walk into another civilization and impose its worldview. But there is another form of power that can be just as complicated. The power to help someone. And choosing not to. That's still a choice. And the episode forces Una to confront that. Because when you're the most technologically advanced person in the room, I'm staying out of this, isn't necessarily neutral. Everybody knows you could intervene. Your decision not to intervene can affect the outcome just as much as your decision to interfere. That's why I think the episode's argument is much more nuanced than Una broke the Prime Directive. It's asking whether non-interference is always morally neutral. And the answer seems to be no. Sometimes it is absolutely the right decision. Sometimes it protects a civilization from outside influence. And sometimes, depending on the circumstances, it can mean standing by while something terrible happens. Starfleet has to live with that contradiction. And so do its officers. Una just happens to be one of the characters willing to admit it. That's why the ending matters. She doesn't walk away believing that rules are meaningless. She walks away understanding that rules have limits. And that distinction is huge, because the best version of Starfleet isn't an organization where everyone follows orders perfectly. It's an organization where people understand why those orders exist and recognize when circumstances demand another choice. That's very different from blind obedience. And honestly, it feels like one of the most authentic ideas Strange New Worlds could explore. The Federation is built on the belief that people can become better, that societies can improve, that institutions can learn from their mistakes. So why would Starfleet itself be exempt from that? It shouldn't be. And maybe that's the bigger point behind Una's decision. She isn't betraying Starfleet's ideals. She's actually defending them, because if Starfleet's purpose is to protect life, seek peace, and represent the best values of the Federation, then following a regulation that directly prevents those ideals from being lived out isn't necessarily loyalty. Sometimes loyalty means saying the institution is wrong, and Una is becoming very comfortable with that idea. Which brings me back to the beginning. The biggest problem Episode 4 exposes isn't that Starfleet has rules. It's that Starfleet sometimes forgets why those rules were created in the first place. Rules are supposed to serve principles, not replace them. And if the people inside Starfleet ever forget that distinction, then the institution can become more concerned with protecting its procedures than protecting the people those procedures were created for. Una's decision is basically a warning against that. And I think that's why this episode could matter more than it seems. Because Una isn't just learning something about Mat'aar XII. She's learning something about herself. She's learning that she can disagree with Starfleet and still love it. She can break a regulation and still believe in the Federation. She can challenge her commanders without becoming their enemy. And perhaps most importantly, she can recognize that doing the right thing isn't always the same as doing what you're told. That is a dangerous lesson for a Starfleet officer. But it's also an incredibly important one, because the Federation was never supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be capable of becoming better. And maybe Una is slowly becoming one of the people who forces it to do exactly that. So when we look back at Episode 4, I don't think the important moment is simply that Una interfered. It's why she decided she had to. She saw a situation where the official answer wasn't good enough. And instead of hiding behind the rule, she made the decision herself. That's not the end of Starfleet's ideals. If anything, it might be the purest expression of them. Because sometimes the person who truly believes in an institution isn't the person who obeys it without question. It's the person who cares enough to tell it when it's wrong. And after Episode 4, I think Una may be becoming exactly that kind of officer.